Okay, now that we've gotten through some of the introductory parts of our class on biotechnology, we're going to get into something what biologists call the central dogma of biology. And what that means is, what it refers to is the idea that genetic information is contained in DNA, that DNA can replicate or copy itself from one cell to another, and that through its derivative, RNA, it controls the manufacturing of proteins in cells. And those proteins in turn control pretty much everything that goes on in cells and in organisms. And all organisms have the same set of processes. So the process of making proteins is the same for human as it is for some little bacterium somewhere. And even all our biological processes are quite similar. So our process of cellular respiration is really not that much different from theirs. So that's why we call it a central dogma, because it applies to all living things. So we're going to start off with this little video on sort of the history of the discovery of DNA. And then we'll move on in class a little bit more about the structure and its function. We'll probably spend a week or two on this. I think last year I probably didn't spend enough time on it, and so we were doing some of the labs, and I think for some people it didn't make so much sense, as much sense as it could have if they'd had a more complete understanding of what DNA is and how it works. So some of this you might have learned in biology or in other courses, but I think much of it will be new. But we're going to start off by talking about this fellow. This is Gregor Mendel, and I think you'll remember him. He worked with garden peas. When you did biology, you did Punnett squares, and worked to understand the laws of inheritance. He was a Czech monk. He worked in Austria. Again, worked with garden peas. And he came up with two laws of genetics, which we still understand today, the law of independent assortment and the law of segregation. So you might remember the law of independent assortment basically says that the inheritance of one trait is independent of the inheritance of another. Now, there are traits that are linked together and often pass from parent to offspring together, but for the most part, they are independent. Just because you've got blonde hair does not necessarily mean you're going to have blue eyes, though they are often tied together. Also the law of segregation, which means that the alleles separate when gametes are formed. Now let's see if you remember this from biology. Gametes are the egg and sperm. The alleles are the different versions of genes. So you might have an allele for brown eyes and an allele for blue eyes. Those alleles separate when egg and sperm are formed, and then they come back together during fertilization to create an organism. Now, think about it. Mendel had no knowledge of genes, didn't know anything about chromosomes, didn't know anything about DNA, and he didn't really have any knowledge of the aspect of molecular inheritance, any idea about molecular inheritance. But he did conclude that there must be something molecular or chemical going on. He just didn't know it. So basically, he described what was happening chemically before the chemical nature of it was actually discovered. So we'll move on a little bit later on. This is Friedrich Mischler. He was a Swiss physician, and he first identified a substance in the nucleus of cells which he called nuclein. He thought it was a protein, but proteins can be denatured by enzymes called proteases, and we'll learn more about this later on in the course. We'll use proteases to denature proteins. He also noticed that this material had some acidic properties, so he called it nucleic acid. And still at this point, we don't know that the nucleus or its contents have anything to do with inheritance. So we're sort of building the story up here. So we started with Mendel, kind of discovered the idea of inheritance. Mischler comes along and finds the substance in the nucleus of cells, and it's a different kind of substance than they're used to working with. Several years later, this gentleman, Thomas Hunt Morgan, he was at Columbia. He worked with fruit flies, and basically his discovery was that some characteristics are carried on a chromosome. Again, they didn't know what a chromosome really was at the time, but he was able to conclude that some kind of information was on an X chromosome, and this was the first evidence that linked inheritance to chromosomes. So chromatin and nuclein had been identified, but their role in inheritance up until now had not been. So here's what we know so far. Mendel, he understood that traits are inherited from parents to offspring, following his laws. Mischler, the nucleus contains chromosomes, and the chromosomes contain nucleic acids. And Morgan discovered the idea that chromosomes are responsible for inheritance. Okay? Now, we know that chromosomes consist of DNA and proteins. Which of these is responsible for inheritance? Okay, so at this point we knew that there was something called DNA and there were proteins in here, but we didn't really understand which part of these were responsible for inheritance. And many scientists had focused on proteins as the genetic material. So then came along Frederick Griffith. Now, he did a classic experiment, which we'll go over a little bit in class. He was a British microbiologist, and he really turned his attention towards DNA, whereas most scientists were focusing on proteins. He experimented with bacteria in rats, and in 1928 he suggested that DNA was the genetic material. And he did this by transforming DNA, which is something that we will be doing. Transforming bacteria with DNA, which is what we're going to be doing. And it's a very powerful technique. He basically took a piece of DNA from one bacteria and put it in another and found that it could transmit a disease. And we'll go over that experiment. Later on, Avery, McLeod, and McCarty. Avery is the lead scientist here, purified DNA. And they provided definitive evidence that it is the genetic material. So now at this point, by 1944, scientists understood that DNA was responsible for genetic inheritance, but they did not know how it worked. So in biology, we talk a lot about structure and function. If we know the structure of DNA, then we'll know how it works. And that's true for a lot of things in science. We understand structure, we can often understand function. We understand that the structure of a bridge relates to its function, right? Okay, Edwin Chargaff, Austrian-American in the 1950s, and he made a very simple observation when he was looking at DNA and trying to understand what it was composed of, that the amount of adenine, which is a component of DNA, was roughly equal to the amount of thymine. And also that the amount of cytosine in a sample was equal to the amount of guanine. So you might remember this, A was the same as T and C was the same as G. Again, it doesn't really tell you that much about structure, but it does tell you something very important later on. So we call this Chargaff's rule. Nice bow tie, Chargaff. Now, here's the real culminating event. James Watson and Frederick Crick discovered the structure of DNA in 1953. They published a 2-page article in Nature, which I'll show you. Just a little article. I mean, if you ever looked at these journals today, the articles go on for pages upon pages. But they published a 2-page article, and it identified the double helix structure of DNA and how the nucleotides are arranged as bases. There was a lot of politics going on here. This was an intense rivalry between a lot of scientists. But in fact, they could not have done any of this without the help and the efforts of a woman called Rosalind Franklin. Watson and Crick got the Nobel Prize in 1962, but Franklin died of cancer in 1958. And it's really a shame. You can't win a Nobel Prize posthumously after you've died. But Rosalind Franklin really deserves a lot of credit here and wasn't given any credit really until the 80s. See, in the 50s, women were just not a part of the scientific community, and there was a lot of sort of jealousy and rivalry, I think, having to do with her high level of intelligence, and I think a lot of the men around her felt threatened by her. Women have definitely come a long way in science, and a lot of it has to do with the work of women like Rosalind Franklin. Actually, after I recorded the first part of this, I want to make one correction. It's Francis Crick. It's late at night here. I don't know why I said Frederick Crick, but it's Francis Crick and James Watson that were responsible for discovering the structure of DNA. So actually what I'd like you to do next, I'm on the computer version, the web browser version of Schoology, not the iPad version, but I want you to go to there's a folder here called Central Dogma, and here, go to the Central Dogma folder, and there's this this PDF here. This is a big chapter from a textbook. So I think the easiest way to do this in your iPad would be to open it up in iBooks. If you don't have iBooks, you probably want to download that app. It's a great app, and it allows you to kind of annotate text as you go along. But this is the chapter. I've just opened up the PDF here, and the section I would like you to read for tomorrow or next time is Section 2.2, the molecule of life. I want you to read this section here, evidence that DNA is the inherited genetic material. I want you to pay particular attention here to, this is the Griffith experiment. I want you to understand how this worked because, again, we're going to be doing bacterial transformations, and it's important to know how the early work in this area was done. So this Griffith's experiment, read up through this. Do not go any further than DNA structure. Okay? Thanks.